9-1, squares and square roots. A square root is a mathematical operation that undoes the squaring process. For example, if we had 3 squared, that's the same as 3 times 3, and that is 9. We can undo this by using the square root symbol called a radical. It looks similar to a division, but not quite. So the square root of 9, you ask yourself, is what two numbers multiply together to give you 9? It has to be the same number. Not one positive and one negative. They both have to be positive or they both have to be negative. The only way to get 9 is to multiply 3 by itself. So the square root of 9 is 3. We have 4 examples on the board. First, we will look at the square root of 36. So I want you to ask yourself, what number times itself gives you 36? 6 times 6 is 36. So that's how we get 6. The square root of 36 is 6. Next, we're going to look at plus or minus the square root of 324. Sometimes the answer can be either positive or negative, and it doesn't make a difference if it's a positive number or a negative number. So we will put the plus and minus out front. And that's going to be very similar to some of the problems you've done in the past. And we'll just take the plus and minus and move it right into the answer. So now we have to think about what is the square root of 324. Most calculators have a square root button on them, and in most cases you're allowed to use that unless you see no calculator. So the square root of 324, you type it into a calculator, 324, hit the square root button, and you find that it's 18. In the lower left-hand corner, we have the negative of the square root of 25. So what number multiplies together to give you 25? That's going to be 5. And then we take the negative sign and put it into the answer. One more example. We want to find the square root of a decimal. So you type into a calculator 2.25, and you hit the square root button, and you end up with 1.5. Now, a very special problem that you're not supposed to know about for a couple of years, the square root of negative 9. Earlier and above, we had 3 squared equals 3 times 3, which is 9. And then the square root of 9 is 3 in red. You'll notice that the square root of 9 is made up of 3 times 3. If we had negative 3 times negative 3, that would also be 9 as well. Very important to notice that it has to be the same number times itself. So if we had to find the square root of negative 9, what number times itself is going to give us negative 9? We cannot use negative 3 times negative 3. That's a positive 9. Positive 3 times positive 3 is a positive 9. We're not allowed to use negative 3 times positive 3 because those are two different numbers. So the book at this point in time tells you that the square root of a negative number, where the negative sign is inside the square root symbol, has no solution. However, that's not quite accurate. In a few years, you'll be taught that the square root of a negative number, the square root of negative 9 in this case, is going to be 3 times I, so 3I. And I is by definition the square root of negative 1. So in this problem, we broke the square root of negative 9 into the square root of positive 9 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of positive 9 is the positive 3, and the square root of negative 1 is an undefined number, so we give it the letter I. It fits into a class of numbers called the imaginary numbers. But these are things you don't need to know about for a couple of years. Just know that they exist. I believe you'll be given a problem or two where you have the square root of a negative number. And just be aware that you can take the square root of the positive and add an I on the end of it. Or write no solution. It's entirely up to you. On this board, we have 2 examples, one where you're going to get to use a calculator and one where you're not going to get to use a calculator. The first one, the square root of 56, you do get to use a calculator. So you type in 56 and you hit the square root button. and you get 7.4833147, so on and so forth. We'd round that off to 7.48. Keep 2 decimal places. Now for the non-calculator problem. We want the negative of the square root of 54. You could type 54, the square root of 54, into a calculator and get an answer. But we need to do this without a calculator. So what we need to do is we need to find the 2 squares that we can find square roots for just below and just above the square root of 54. I know that the square root of 49 is 7, is just below the square root of 54. And then I also know that if that's 7, this 8 squared is going to be 64. So the negative of the square root of 54 is somewhere between the negative of the square root of 49 and the negative of the square root of 64. So now we see that 54 fits somewhere in between. We want to find where the square root of 54 fits evenly in between 49 and 64. And the square root of 54 is 5 units away from 49, but 10 units away from 64. So we know it's going to be negative 7 point something. Because 54 is closer to 49, we're going to use less than 0.5 because 0.5 gives us halfway between 49 and 64, and we know we're less than halfway. So we can call it 7.3. So the negative of the square root of 54 is negative 7.3. It's an approximation. It's not exact, but your answers need to be somewhat reasonable. Your homework is on page 439, problems 12 to 48, the evens.